Hello everyone, this is Mr. Crowe, and today we're going to look at the period in European history known as the Renaissance. The Renaissance runs roughly from approximately 1400 to 1600, and in this era there is a period of interest or celebration of antiquity, specifically the Roman and Greek culture, and the ideas that were created during classical civilization. And those ideas begin to become very, very important to the post-medieval European mindset. This is an era where thinkers and artists and writers begin to show more interest in the accomplishments and possibility of human beings as well, rather than focusing solely on the church or religious or spiritual matters. So this is known as kind of a secular age, or the rise of secularism, which basically means non-religious concerns. The term Renaissance is a French word that literally means rebirth. It was coined in the 1850s, many centuries later, by a Swiss historian. So the people who actually are living during this time, between 1400 and 1600, didn't know or would not have referred to themselves as living in the Renaissance. They didn't think of themselves at the beginning of a rebirth of anything. But indeed that was what was going on. 15th century saw an unprecedented scholarly renaissance. Italian and Northern European humanists began to recover classical knowledge and languages, and they set in motion educational reforms and cultural changes that would spread throughout Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. And in this period, you need to be familiar with the term vernacular, which is at the bottom of the screen here, if I can point to it, yeah. Vernacular, or the local language, it began to take its place alongside Latin, which was the international language, as a widely used literary and political means of communicating information. It's one of the ways that the ideas of the Renaissance do begin to spread, is that people began to use the languages of the regions or the countries that they lived in. You saw more things created and communicated in German, in English, in French, etc., rather than just having it in Latin, which of course was very, very important to the Universal Catholic Church. Okay, so this birth of or revival of arts and classical ideas first takes place in the cities of northern Italy beginning in the late 1300s. Several factors made this region the cradle of the Renaissance. The Renaissance starts in Italy. Italian cities were independent from feudal monarchs and lords because of the long struggle between the popes and the Holy Roman emperors. If you recall, dating back to the era of Charlemagne, he was the guy that kind of united for a time in the 9th century, attempt to unite what was the old Roman Empire in Northern Europe, and had the blessing of the Pope at the time, and that the term Holy Roman Empire was created. But really, when you think of Holy Roman Empire, you should think of Germany, the first incarnation of Germany. If you look at the screen now, you can see that it was, especially at the bottom right portion of the screen down here, you can see that it really wasn't a unified kind of empire. There were over 300 different principalities and kingdoms and duchies and provinces, etc., etc. So there was that conflict between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so there we go. So the cities that ruled their surrounding region in Italy become known as city-states. And as we shall see, this form of political organization in Italy doesn't really go away for centuries. In fact, Italy doesn't unify as a single nation until the 1870s. So for most of this period, and for even into the next unit, we'll see different national powers trying to gain influence or control territory in Italy, whether it's France or Austria or even the Holy Roman Empire. So why Italy? Why the Italian city-states? Why does the Renaissance begin there? Well, another factor that helped make Italy the cradle of the Renaissance was the great amount of wealth that it was acquiring in the late medieval period. The Italian city-states capitalized on their geographic proximity to the eastern Mediterranean world and all those very, very lucrative trade routes that you've been reading about, as well as their strong commercial ties with Byzantine as well as Muslim merchants. Now, each Italian city-state carved out a niche in the world of trade to become prosperous centers of European commerce, and they become very, very wealthy. Some cities manufactured a product that was sought after in Europe and the East. For example, the city-state of Milan concentrated on the production of metal goods and armor. Others, such as Florence, raised capital through the cloth industry and become important banking centers, and in turn used their profits to buy goods in the East to market to the rest of Europe. So, in other words, the Italian city-states are becoming kind of the middlemen in the trade route between the Near East and the rest of Europe. So they took advantage of that and become very, very wealthy because of that. Still others like Venice, which was kind of a transit port of the mouth of the passage that links Europe and the Byzantine world, established themselves as trade centers, attracting merchants from around Europe to their markets and warehouses, which stocked Asian goods. Italian city-states convert this wealth into political power by expanding their rule to far-flung trade empires. European monarchs and nobles who needed money to finance wars and programs of expansion really looked to the Italian city-states as kind of the bankers or the people who were going to loan them money to do these things, and they become indebted to Italian merchants from whom they sought these loans. Now, Florence was without a doubt the most influential of all the Italian city-states, and the most famous Florentine merchant family was known as the Medici. The Medicis were the kind of the godfathers of the Renaissance. They grew extremely wealthy after the 13th century, making their money in buying and selling cloth and other goods. But eventually the family rose to prominence through banking. And by the 1300s, they had become the chief bankers for even the Pope. By 1430, the Medici had branches of their bank in Milan, Venice, Pisa, Rome, even in France and Avignon, Switzerland, Geneva, and even London. In one 5-year period, the Medici banking network profited almost 300,000 florins, which would be worth more than $4 million today. Because of the Medici's vast wealth, family members rule Florence behind the scenes for over 3 generations, starting with Cosimo Medici, who would have been this guy up here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to draw on him or not. There we go. That's Cosimo. And then down here would be his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent. But Cosimo Medici was the original Medici. And as I said, they ruled Florence during the height of the Italian Renaissance, in large part not only because of their wealth, but also because of their interest in the civic and cultural life of the city. Each Medici leader encouraged the development of the arts and become important patrons. You need to be familiar with that word, a patron of the arts. And that's basically somebody who funds the artist, who pays for them to live and to continue to work. Otherwise, the artists would not have a means of supporting themselves. So the Medici were very important patrons of painters and sculptors such as Michelangelo. You can see Michelangelo's David here. If you ever get to go to the Vatican, you'll see the Pietà. This would be the Pietà, and this is David. And yes, don't tell your parents that you're seeing a naked body, but that is Renaissance art for you. And not only artists like painters and sculptors, but also architects like Brunelleschi, as well as humanists and Renaissance scholars. The Medici set up the artists' workshops, supported the artists, and collected some of the finest works for their palaces. So they were using these works of art to show their power, their prestige, their status. Under the patronage of powerful families like the Medici, the Renaissance becomes a time of renewed interest in the scholarship, art, and architecture of classical Greece and Rome. And you can kind of see in Michelangelo's David, you can see very, very close similarities to classical sculpture in Greece and Rome. So yeah, pause that. Okay, so you may ask yourself how a celebration of the classical era of Plato and Aristotle, of Roman and Greek ideals, how that is something that's new or how it's a rebirth. The reason is that it's the only place that these ideas had been used, the only place that these ideas had been used in the Middle Ages was in the church or in the sphere of theology. But now Greek and Roman ideas are being rediscovered across the board and are being used to celebrate things outside of the religious. For example, William Shakespeare writes during the Renaissance, and he shows a tremendous interest in Roman antiquity in plays like Julius Caesar, as well as Antony and Cleopatra, for example. So the inspiration that fuels the Renaissance to a great extent comes from a rediscovery of the classical world of Roman Greece. And as I said in a previous lecture, after the Crusades, Greek scholars and monks began visiting Italy to maintain ties that had been developed after crusading Europeans had renewed contact with the Eastern Mediterranean world. For some time before the 14th century, Greek scholars had been migrating to Italy, often to escape the expansion of the Muslim world into the Hellenic world, or the Ottomans into the Byzantine lands. The result of these movements or migrations or this cultural exchange was a reintroduction of classical Christian and pre-Christian thought to Italy. And the impact of this new knowledge on Europeans was tremendous. In the 15th century, Italian scholars began eagerly studying the Greek to be able to access information that for centuries had been lost from a Western perspective. Perhaps the most important document translated in the early Renaissance was a first century treatise on education written by a Roman scholar named Quintilian. Quintilian argued that the goal of education was not simply learning or specialization, but the creation of a well-rounded, moral citizen who would use education to make a society that he lived in a just and a better place. And you needed a well-rounded, educated person to do this. His view of moral education emphasized also the potential of the individual, which of course is a big Renaissance theme. And this view becomes the dominant educational philosophy of the Renaissance. Now, the spirit of and renewal in the presence of the knowledge and tenets of the ancients combined to produce a new type of scholar called a humanist. Humanists place emphasis on mankind and the individual. They focused on the study of humans and not of the divine. And humanism didn't just focus on what people were doing, but what people were capable of doing, what they had the potential of doing. And this really bridges the gap between the medieval mind and the modern mind. Humanists do not necessarily reject God or Christianity, but they really shift their focus, or rather they expand their focus to include humans, or to include God and humans. So when I say humanists were secular, there were Christian humanists as well. So it's not exactly accurate to say they were non-religious. But what they do include is a study of the accomplishments of humans and their potential. Humanists see the period of 500 BC to 500 CE as the great era of human history, when the Greeks and the Romans are at their peak. They see 500 CE to 1350 CE as simply, the Dark Ages or an era of decay. The Middle Ages they see as the period where human accomplishment regresses backwards by many centuries. And indeed, they were accurate in many respects. And it's only at the end of the Middle Ages that humanity begins crawling back towards civilization, according to humanists. Humanists studied the humanities. They studied history, rhetoric, poetry, grammar, philosophy. Traditional medieval scholarships consisted of reading commentaries on ancient writers, oftentimes without ever reading any of the ancient authors' works or studying the context in which they were written. Instead, humanists wanted to study the actual historical works without reading the commentaries. So essentially, they wanted to go to the primary source instead of reading about these works in a secondary lens. And so they want to discover the meaning of the author by going to the original text. That was a big idea for humanists. Humanists believed that this course of study would make them well-rounded individuals, better able to participate in civic government and new urban society. In fact, the phrase Renaissance man you might have heard, is often used and comes from this era. A Renaissance man is an individual who excels in all disciplines. Someone who might be a lawyer or a doctor or a theologian, a historian, a playwright, a poet. That was a Renaissance man, like Leonardo da Vinci. And that was possible during the Renaissance. I would say it's not really possible now because everything is so specialized and the fields of knowledge are so detailed. Just think about being a doctor. You can't find, many doctors who aren't some kind of specialists of one kind or another. So Renaissance man is something that was, though, truly possible then. Not so much now, but it is a phrase that you'll hear. The first and probably the greatest humanist, and he's also known as the father of humanism, was, of course, Petrarch. This guy's born in Florence in 1304. His great love was the discovery of ancient texts, works forgotten during the Middle Ages. He especially prized the works of the Roman statesman Cicero, who wrote about Roman history, and he also was interested in the early Christian writer St. Augustine. Petrarch wrote lengthy letters to the ancient thinkers, like as if they were still alive, in which he copied their style and subject matter while presenting his own modern views about their ancient ideas. His works, as well as the texts he discovered and translate, become masterpieces of the new spirit of the Renaissance. If you ever get to read him, you'll see his letter to antiquity, and he's basically saying, he wished that he had been born many, many centuries earlier to live in the age of the classical period. So, now, another famous work, or one of the more influential of all the Renaissance humanist writings, was a short treatise called The Prince, you may have heard of, published by Niccolo Machiavelli in 1513. Now, this showed kind of the political side of the Renaissance. The subject of The Prince is how leaders use their political power and how they gain and maintain their political power. As a humanist, he was quite interested in human nature, and his assumption that human beings are selfish and generally evil led him to conclude that a prince must manipulate people in order to reach his goals for the state. He admired leaders in France and England because they knew how to exercise power and how to build strong states, which, of course, the city-states of Italy had never unified, and they were always warring with each other. And he would have argued that Italy needed to be a unified country, needed to be strong. In The Prince, Machiavelli is the first to treat politics as really a science. He's the first political scientist, if you will. And it foreshadowed the coming of an age when politics really breaks from religion, which during the medieval period would have been unthinkable during that time. Now, keep in mind, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the Renaissance and a lot of what you've been reading about, this is only occurring amongst a very, very small percentage of the population. It doesn't begin to spread until much, much later. So it's really focused among the educated, the literate, mainly among the aristocratic and upper crust of society. Most people would not have had any inkling or idea of the art that was being created during this period, or of humanistic thought. This was not something that was happening in the fields, when people are farming or working. So at this point in European history, there's still no notion of human equality, whether it be gender or racial or even social. The notion of equality still does not exist yet, and that's important to understand. The Renaissance is in reality an elitist movement. After all, about 97% of the European population at this time was illiterate. They don't learn to read or write overnight, and the illiteracy rate really doesn't go down significantly until the 18th and 19th centuries. However, it is important to know that during this period, the Renaissance is credited with inventing the idea of individualism, of humanistic thought. That is the notion that individuals are worthwhile, they're intelligent, they're valuable, they have some worth. This notion, of course, clashes with the Christian idea of original sin, that man's nature is depraved and inherently sinful. And it really is a major shift in the way that people think about each other and also the way that they think about themselves. and there's more of a focus on the here and now during this period. And it is really the opening of the modern way in which we think about ourselves as individuals, which is a very modern concept.